Should we install coronavirus tracking apps on our phones?
And is Apple's new iPhone SE worth getting excited about?
Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award winning network and Australian based support. Hey there, welcome to your weekly slice of Vertical Hold behind the tech news, the podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading technology journalists to get the stories behind the news of the week. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm joined as always by Alex Kidman, a man who's more than happy to stay indoors permanently if it means he can spend more time working on his Donkey Kong high score.
Well, look, Adam, usually that'd be true. At the moment, actually, I've been playing a surprising array of oddly modern games, including Ape Out, a game which is all about a big ape trying to escape to the great outdoors. That's probably just coincidental, of course.
Yeah, he better not get caught. They frown upon that kind of thing. This week, we're also joined once again by a longtime friend of the show, news technology editor, Jen Dudley Nicholson. Jen, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Now, Jen, you've had to adjust from working in a busy newsroom to working from home in Brisbane. What's the most surprising discovery about working from home?
I suppose I had this vision of it where I would just, go to the kitchen whenever I wanted and make myself the most amazing lunches and everything was going to be healthy and amazing and I was going to live in this pod of happiness and well-being. Yeah, not so much. Turns out there's been quite a lot of news on and I have been very busy in my cupboard.
Yes, it's dangerous working within arm's reach of the kitchen. I've always found that. Alex and I have worked from home for about 15 years each, and you have to be very strict with yourself when it comes to that.
If I was just allowed out of the cupboard, that would be a benefit. So yes, I'll work on that.
Is that your little home office just hiding away in the cupboard trying to get things done?
It is. It's never seen so much action. My 2012 MacBook iMac, yeah, it's seeing a lot of keystrokes that it's never seen before.
So this week, the federal government is fast-tracking a Bluetooth-based coronavirus tracking app to help us combat the spread of the virus. And we'll be looking into the technical and the social impacts of that a little later. But first, Apple's released its second product in the middle of the coronavirus lockdown. But unlike the iPad Pro, this one's kind of affordable. Well, I'm saying kind of there. Alex, what's the story with the new iPhone SE?
So the new iPhone SE, which they've announced overnight relative to when we're recording this, is essentially it looks an awful lot like the iPhone 8, and the iPhone 8 itself has been discontinued, officially speaking. But it's sort of got the guts of an iPhone 11 in there. So you're still only looking at a 4.7-inch screen. It's only an LCD, not an OLED. You've only got a single camera out the back. But it has this massive engine in the form of the Apple A13 Bionic processor, which is the same processor you get in like the 11, the 11 Pro, the Pro Max. So for once, the SE is actually pacing directly with where Apple's what you might call true premium phones are placed. Jen, did you get excited by the news of the new SE?
I'm excited because I think that this was a phone that had a big following. Actually, yes, it's smaller, so it's not necessarily for everyone, and it is a cut down version of an iPhone. But there's a lot of interest in cut down versions of iPhone, particularly if you're going to buy an iPhone for somebody else, or if you just don't like, basically paying as much as my car for a phone. So I'm thinking that it's actually, even though it's weird timing, it's actually good timing if you need to replace your phone.
Yeah, I mean, you say it's lower cost, and I suppose we've got to frame that they start at $749, which is not a cheap smartphone. You can get way cheaper than that, but not for a new iPhone, or at least not anymore now that the 7 and 8 are officially off the market.
Absolutely not. And I mean, it does need to be framed in that way because $749 is not something that you'd find in the couch. But at the same time, when you're talking about, being able to access Apple's ecosystem and being able to access it without going, no, I don't need those software updates because it might absolutely ruin my device. I think that this one is actually reasonably accessible. Maybe we need to call it accessible rather than affordable.
So, were we expecting a new SE? It's been a few years since we saw the last one, hasn't it?
It's been 4 years, so almost 4 years to the date, which in terms of technology is like a decade,
Mm.
especially because March went on for at least 2 years. Um, So I think that I don't know if many people were sort of expecting this because we saw the cut down version, Apple's version of a cut down version, in the iPhone 10R when it came out. So I think a lot of people thought that maybe Apple had moved on from the SE edition, but apparently no, it's still in the market. And I think that there is still a group of people who will be very excited that this phone is coming out.
I wonder how many of them though are pleased that it's basically built on the framework of the iPhone 8. Because the thing with the 2016 SE, which almost does stretch back a decade actually, because when it was contemporary, the iPhone 6 was the premium model, but the SE was built on the chassis of the iPhone 4. So you really do stretch back there. That was even smaller. That was a 4-inch screen. This is still a largish phone by the standards of the people who might have been holding on to an SE.
Oh, absolutely. But honestly, you bring out a 4-inch phone and it is like going back in time and
Mm.
looking at a time portal and thinking, how on earth did I use that thing? So I think it makes sense for them to at least go up one size. And when you compare it to a modern flagship iPhone, then certainly you'll be able to see the differences. And even on when it comes to the camera, like you'll be able to see the differences because there's only one camera out the back. There's one lens on it, but I think that there's still a market for that. And I think that people have kind of adapted to thinking that 4.7-inch screens are actually kind of small now.
That comparison is an interesting one though, because you're right with like the 11 Pro Max, for example, which of course is way more expensive than the new SE. Yeah, that maybe doesn't compare, like for like. But the iPhone 11, which tips the scales at a bit over a grand, is a bigger screen, but not that much more that Apple has announced in terms of other differences. There's a few things we're going to have to wait until someone can tear apart an iPhone SE to find out, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it makes sense to have something at the lower end of the scale, but there might not be huge differences between the two. Apple has to weigh up exactly how cheap they can go because obviously they want their brand to be premium. They don't want their brand to be, seen as to be too Android like, where they do very much cut down versions, and people don't have the optimum experience that they're expecting. So I think this is as low in terms of features and specs that Apple would go.
The processor, I think, is the really key thing because it's not just that they've given it this grunty engine, it's also that it means this phone should see the next couple of iOS releases pretty comfortably, which, for example, the iPhone 8 probably won't.
Exactly, and I think that gets some people into trouble, and also gets some people really frustrated. We also saw that Apple lawsuit earlier. Was it this year or last year, where people were talking about Apple actually slowing down phones on purpose because that to get people to upgrade or to get people to be able to upgrade and then be able to access the latest software. At least they won't have that issue with this phone. Like it does, as you say, it has a lot of grunt in that chip. You're talking about some nice neural engine processing involved in that, and a big boost in terms of GPU as well. And so those sorts of things will make this phone a very easy phone to use and potentially future proof it for a while. 4 years, I'm not sure about, but at least a couple of years.
How long does Apple tend to try and maintain support for older devices on new operating systems? I think it used to be maybe 3 or 4 years. Have they got like a hard rule, or is it just a minimum?
There's not a hard rule, but I know that the iPhone 6 is starting to show strain. And that was such a big phone for Apple that I think it's been passed down a lot of times. And
Yeah.
now people who have an iPhone 6 really need to think about upgrading. But I think that for any device now, you really have to think about maintaining software and maintaining updates to it for at least 4 years because people are hanging on to their phones for longer. So whereas we used to see upgrade cycles creep down to 18 months. Now we're seeing them push out to 3 years, and that being sort of a comfortable space for people. I think they have to do whatever they can to make sure that for at least 4 years, you can use a smartphone.
So will the iPhone 6 run whatever the current version of iOS is at the moment? I think iOS 13, I want to say.
I think the iPhone 6 has been the cutoff, and so it's now failing to get software updates.
This year, when we get iOS 14, then another iPhone might drop off the end as being no longer able to run the latest iOS. And as soon as that happens, you then run into problems where apps won't install because they demand the latest iOS before they'll install.
Exactly.
And it's also the case that even if, a device manufacturer, whether it be Apple or Google, says you can install the software, it doesn't necessarily mean you will have a great experience
Yeah.
after installing the software as well. So you have to kind of factor that in and let other people go first and see how they can break their phones if you have one of those older devices.
There's another big challenge here, actually, in terms of that experience over 3 years that does concern me about this phone. I think in a lot of ways it's a smart move from Apple, but not in terms of the battery life, because they've said, well, Apple never actually comes out and says, hey, it's got a battery that's this big. Again, we're going to wait till someone rips one apart to find out. They have said that the battery is comparable to that of the iPhone 8, not the 8 Plus, but just the 8. And I'm sorry, the 8 did not have good battery life, not by modern standards. It's the one thing where the other comparable new iPhones, the 11, 11 Pro, and 11 Pro Max, will do a lot better because they've just got larger batteries. And if Apple's only confident that this can stretch back to the iPhone 8 era of battery life, then, well, you're probably going to be reaching for that charger a few times a day once we can all get out of our home offices.
For my, like, as you say, the iPhone 8 did not have great battery life. That was my experience as well. I think that Apple does a really good job in comparison to some other manufacturers in terms of preserving that battery life, because they're not into, massively multitasking and cramming these things full of RAM, but actually smartly kind of managing battery life and some of the electronic usage through through the device. However, as you say, iPhone 8, not so great. So it'll be interesting to actually get one of these devices and play with it and try to make it run out.
What are the other big things that you're sacrificing? Like, are you missing out on wireless charging or stuff like that, the premium sort of features?
Wireless charging is actually there, so
Oh,
that's
okay.
that's one that they've added, because that came in, as I understand it, with the iPhone 8 as well. And it's actually got some water and dust resistance as well, which I was quite impressed with, because those are the sorts of things, whether you've got a premium phone or you've got a cheaper phone, they're really handy to have. Especially if you've got it in your pocket all of the time because it's so small and it can fall out into the toilet. Not that it's happened to me, but I know it happens to a lot of people. And seriously, stop taking your phone into the toilet. Um,
That
but
sounded totally believable, Jen.
Totally believable.
No, I swear, Scouts on it. Stop taking your phone into the toilet, because I don't want to have to touch them when you say something goes wrong with my phone. Can you have a look at it? No, it's full of toilet germs.
I don't think
Um,
anyone wants to touch anyone's phone anymore again, ever, but I take your point.
I will plead social distancing just for that reason. Um, but I don't know how this is going to go with things like AR, for example, and portrait mode. I really want to see as well, because it doesn't have multiple cameras at the back of this device. So they've said that they're going to use all the smarts, and certainly Google have done that quite well in terms of providing an approximation of what a digital SLR might do in terms of keeping something in the foreground in focus and stuff in the background a little bit out of focus. But I'm interested to see how well that does, and also whether it will work with augmented reality.
Yeah, AR was going to be my next question, because obviously the AR features are partly reliant on the cameras. So it'll be interesting to see how much it can and can't do if it doesn't have the same cameras as the others.
But they already do this kind of thing with the existing iPhone 11. It's basically, at least at a technical specifications level, the same module as on the iPhone 11. So Apple's already positioned for that. Jen,
Okay.
you brought up Google, though, and I think that's a really interesting one, because the other big rumored phone that's apparently due to drop any day now is the Pixel 4a. And that's Google's lower cost Pixel. This very much feels comparable. It's Apple's lower cost iPhone.
Absolutely, and we've seen the smartphones that we've seen come out lately, with the exception of Samsung, who pushed ahead with their folding phone. They've been kind of in that lower cost area, because people still need phones. Like, they might be at home, they might be not as mobile, but like when you've got a home office, your mobile phone just continually goes off. And if
Yeah.
you happen to drop it when you're out exercising, or whether you're at home and the bathroom tiles claim it, you still need a phone. So the phones we've seen have been in that mid-range category, and I think that'll continue for a while. And I think that'll be probably the most popular purchases that we see in the phone space for some time.
So Google I/O would have been coming up in about a month, Jen, and we could go back and leave our luggage in that dodgy bong shop in San Francisco again.
Or not.
But or not. But They don't tend to launch phones at I/O, do they? It's a developer conference, and it tends to be more features like the AI voice on the phone, and we saw some Google Homes and that. But that Pixel probably wouldn't have held out to be launched at I/O, would it?
I think it would actually, because last year
Okay.
we saw the 3A and the 3A XL come
Oh,
out
we
at
did. Obviously, I
I/O.
wasn't paying attention. I was there and I forgot.
Including they had the purple one, so I remembered this well.
Okay.
Um, so that there's normally some hardware element, although obviously that
Yeah.
isn't the focus, as you mentioned. Like it's all about the software, but with a side, yeah, helping of you'll probably need a device to run this on.
Yeah.
So I think this is the device that we could have seen come out at I/O. I think it's a bit strange too, and maybe it wasn't going to work with the sort of numbers that Google deal with, that we've seen I/O completely cancelled. So maybe we'll still see an announcement of some kind. It just won't be kind of a place for developers to share ideas and get the latest information. And they'll have to think of a new format for that.
You would think if anyone was set up to run some kind of, online equivalent, it would be Google.
Maybe the fact that they don't means that it really shouldn't happen. Because personally, I wouldn't want to see hundreds of people on a Zoom chat either. So
Yeah.
maybe it's for the best.
And IO is also very hands-on. A big part of it is not just the keynotes and stuff, but the areas where they set up the different technologies and all the developers can go around and test it out. I would think once you took that away, you've lost a big chunk of the value that IO actually delivers to developers. It's not just sitting in a stadium listening to someone talk.
Absolutely, and there's like small what they call campfire sessions where like
Yeah,
it's a small kind of 10 on 1 kind of experience. You're not going to have that many breakouts because you can't manage it. So maybe that's why. I understand they did something similar earlier this year when the information was first coming out about coronavirus, just around I think it was a cloud program that they had going on. And you would think that a cloud conference would easily transfer to the online world, but if Google can't make it happen, then maybe it just can't happen.
yeah.
But everyone's struggling with this. I mean, WWDC, Apple's own event, is in the same basket, and just closer to home. Pretty much every product briefing I've had from PR has had the same kind of thing going on. You get a Zoom call, you show off the phone because you can, or you show off the device, depends on what it is, but you lose an awful lot of that immediacy. I don't know that there's an easy solution for that for anyone.
No, and I think it's going to be something that we continue to work on. I'm actually quite heartened to see the fact that there are still devices coming out. Like, even though we're getting this iPhone now, it is a bit unusual because the stores are shut. Like, the Apple stores are shut. And a lot of these things will have to be purchased sight unseen. Yes, you can still go into a JB Hi-Fi, for example, but a lot of people are choosing not to. Personally, if it was me, I'd order it online, as I've done with other devices during the last 4 weeks where I've been working from home. So it's kind of a gutsy move to still be launching these products, and I'm glad that people are doing it because our need for technology isn't slowing down at all, and it's good to have options.
So, Alex, these days we're all a little bit nervous when we leave the house because you just don't know, who people are, where they've been. You don't want to get too close. And one of the things that they've been talking about is the idea of contact tracking apps. So if you do happen to catch the virus, they can figure out who's you've been around, or if you've been around someone who's caught the virus, they can give you a heads up so you can maybe go and get tested. But it may not be all that straightforward. What's happening, and what maybe should we be concerned about?
Yeah, so the Australian government has basically said that they're going to develop a coronavirus tracing application, which they would like to see at least 40% of the population take up. That seems to be the critical figure at which they work out that you're going to get enough coverage of where Australians live, bearing in mind that there's an awful lot of this country that nobody lives in. We all
Hmm.
tend to be clustered around the seaboard, but about 40% take up minimum. The more, the better, and they're taking as its basis, or at least what they've said they're going to take as its basis, is an app called Trace Together, which was developed by the Singapore government, which uses Bluetooth for tracking. And it's a slightly tricky one to get your head around. And there's a lot to kind of unpack here because there's both the technology behind it and then the security and privacy side of it. And on the technology side, the thing that I think a lot of people are getting wrong, and it's not helped by the fact that the government has just said, we're developing this, this will come soon, because it means there are other features that could get added. But based on what Trace Together does, basically it acts like a little Bluetooth beacon. And Bluetooth is really noisy. It wants to shout out, hey, I'm over here, to any other Bluetooth devices. In this case, what it would be doing, if I unfortunately had coronavirus, as far as I know I don't, I would go out, my phone would be saying, right, Alex is the plague victim. The equivalent of, Middle Ages, me running around clanging a bell to let people know that I had the plague. And then but a bell that human beings can't hear, but phones can. Your phone, Adam, would then go, well, I was in that briefing with Alex for 15 minutes or more, and therefore you've been near someone who has identified as having this particular condition. Therefore, the odds of you needing to get tested or the odds of you having had a dangerous exposure go up. Therefore, you should go and get tested. That's the kind of nuts and
That'd
bolts of
have
it.
to be retrospective, though, right? Because you couldn't leave the house with your phone going, this guy's got it. Because if this guy's got it, you shouldn't be leaving the bloody house, right? What it's doing is when you find out that you've got it, you tell the app, and the app goes, oh, well, who the hell have you been here in the last 2 weeks? And it lets
Precisely
those
so.
people know. Yeah.
Precisely so.
So, Jen, does this sound like the kind of thing you want pinging around on your phone?
I want to know a lot more about it
Yeah.
because, I was on a briefing with Apple and Google, and I really want to know if it's using the same methodology essentially, because they've got some interesting ideas around how this will be private, how this is not sharing. So, for example, like it's not using GPS data. I watched the news last night where they said it did, and no, that's not the case. As Alex was saying, it's Bluetooth beacons. It's a completely different type of technology. As a result of this, and I don't think people really know this as much, the government can't use this information to identify hotspots of the virus, for example, because they can't. They're not sort of getting access to that information where they can put it on a map and say, okay, it's huge in Cabramatta, it's massive on the outskirts of Brisbane. This is sort of individualized information. And so if that's the case, I'm actually quite interested in it. And I would love to know if I've been near a case of coronavirus so that I don't spread it to my elderly relatives or my relatives who really should know better, and don't call themselves elderly but really are. In terms of the technology, I'm really interested in how it works. And I've also read different reports, for example, that you need to keep it in the foreground rather than the background. Now, nobody's going to be keeping this, especially, for example, as on the iPhone, keeping this open so that it doesn't go into the background, then doesn't ping as much. We need to have more discussion about how it's going to work, how people are going to be alerted, and also how these cases are going to be verified. So I've seen an app called Snoopit, rather, and they try to do this thing where they pinpoint different cases of coronavirus around you. And in general, they've been quite good at verifying some of these things. But every now and again, somebody will, dob in their housemate unfairly because, they want people to stay away from their house or they think it's a hilarious prank. This isn't a tool that you want people using for a hilarious prank. So you do need to have some sort of information that's verified to put into this so you can say, yes, this person actually did have coronavirus, has been positively identified in that way, and therefore we can tell all of the people around them that they've been for the past 2 weeks to actually alert them and for this to be useful. I don't think that's been made 100% clear, and I know that the government wants to come out and say, yes, look, we're developing this because they've had a lot of people asking, me in particular, but I would love to know exactly what technology they're using for it.
So when you say it doesn't use GPS, so basically if you and I are standing next to each other at the bus stop and it turns out later that one of us has got it, so it wants to go and tell the other one, I've got it and it wants to tell you, it doesn't know that you and I were standing at the bus stop. It doesn't know where we were. All it knows is that I was near you, but there's no way to pin that down on a map.
That's right. And as I understand it, with the Apple and Google software that they're developing, and they're developing it as an API.
Now, hang on, sorry,
first,
that's the other thing I want to clarify. Apple and Google, what they're talking about is different to what the Australian government's talking about, isn't it? They're not the same thing.
It might be.
It might be.
So just to jump in here, the Australian government has said they're using Trace Together, or they're using some of the software that the Singaporean government is providing them as the basis for that app. And this is where some of the confusion comes in, because if it's the basis, they can bolt other stuff onto it. They could, in theory, bolt GPS. They have not said they're going to do that. I have to be clear there. What Apple and Google have said in the first cases, they're developing a joint API, and this is basically so that if I've got it on an iPhone and Jen's got it on an Android phone, we're not stuck with the two phones going, well, I would talk to the Android version of the app, but I'm not talking to the iOS version of the app, and vice versa, so that that kind of data can flow clearly. They've said in the future they're going to then develop apps and hard bake this in. And I guess that's also where that kind of foreground, background stuff can come in, because whilst, Jen, you're right, iPhones typically tend to switch off Bluetooth when it's not in use, Apple can break their own rules if they want to.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most important things that came out of all of this too, when they were explaining it, is that these beacons don't identify you. So they can't even, all of the information is actually stored on the phone itself rather than uploaded to some server where, I'm not saying Peter Dutton, but someone like him can have their way with it. This is all information that is stored on the phone and is then shared in a system between phones. So nobody could identify it was you, for example. So if we had been standing at that bus stop, you couldn't have said, "Oh, bloody Jen." Um, so,
Tinfoil hat moment,
and
though,
it's
Jen, just to interrupt. Tinfoil hat moment, though.
yes,
That's what Trace Together does. That's not necessarily what the government app does. And that's, I think, the bigger information story we need. We need to know what this is going to be doing and the scope of how they're going to use this, because we've seen pretty frequently with government bodies and technology tracking that the data can go some pretty wild and interesting places.
Yeah, and the arguments that we've had with this government about metadata and what they call metadata and how they use it and who can access it gives people not a lot of confidence that they can be trusted with it.
they do have a bit of a track record that says no. And honestly, if it wasn't for a worldwide pandemic, you would say, no, absolutely not, hands off my phone data. I think
Hmm.
it's when you're talking about potentially protecting yourself and people around you, that's when people are going to start to think about it. I think that they're going to have to come out and do a really big sales pitch and also explain a lot of the background detail in order to get that 40% of people across the line. I've heard various reports that you really need higher rates of use for it to be incredibly useful. Potentially as much as 60%, which would obviously be great. As long as that information has a finite use, and there are massive rules and regulations about how it will be used, how long it will be used, what it can actually do. I think we all need to understand a lot more about it.
Yeah. One of my other concerns is that there are people out there who are looking for any excuse they can to send everybody back to work and school because economy, and that's all that matters. And I'm worried that while there might be genuine health benefits to this app, that some people will just use this app as an excuse to say, right, now I'll get out there and get back to what you were doing so the shareholders don't suffer. So I'd hate to think that this app was just, a pawn in that bigger game of trying to kickstart the economy at the expense of, pensioners, and who cares if they die.
I think that's become clear over the past week, but at the same time, even though I don't think that we should rush out and all get back to work and start, licking the shopping centre shelves or whatever it is we like to do.
Don't hobby shame
One of
me.
my favorite hobbies. I can't believe I had to give that up. Yeah.
I knew it. No wonder this thing spreads. I think it is important that we have some sort of strategy. And in Australia, we have a lot of mobile phones. So this sort of a strategy makes sense, particularly here, because at some point I will need to leave the house. My vitamin D levels are depleting already. My frustration levels are slowly rising, and not now. Obviously, we need to flatten the curve as much as possible. We need to make sure that the hospitals aren't overwhelmed. But at some point, we will need to leave the house again, and it would be nice to have the backing of some sort of useful technology to do that in the safest possible way.
I think it'd be more than nice, actually. There's another benefit apart from obviously being able to help people get tested when they need to. And you kind of alluded to this earlier, Jen. It was a brilliant point that it's actually quite good for mental health. I'm the person who goes out and does my family food shop once a week. And it's really stressful right now because
Yeah.
every time I do it, I've got to think, right, I really need to not, um, you know, not come into contact with anyone. I'm really conscious when I'm in the supermarket about doing that, but I've seen so many people who just aren't, and that's a real jerk move, but people are still doing that. In fact, Jenna, I think you on social media coined the phrase, my face is lava, in terms of not
Yes.
touching your face. Having that confidence to be able to say, right, I know, or I can feel more confident that I am not going to be putting myself at risk right now, or that I didn't put myself at risk, would, I think, alleviate a lot of mental stress. Because outside of the obvious coronavirus health problems, I think the mental health toll that this is going to have on the population as a whole is going to be immense.
Yeah, but without wanting to ruin that for you, this having this app on everybody's phone is not going to reduce the chances of you coming into contact with someone who has it. And it's not going to reduce the chances of you catching it. It's just going to increase the chances of them telling you quickly if you might have it.
However, it will increase the chances that if I know I've come into contact with somebody at the supermarket who's been licking the shelves, then I will not go and see people. Even stand outside their house. I
Exactly.
Good
will not
point.
go in
Yeah.
and come into contact with people who I know are vulnerable. And I think that would provide a lot of peace of mind for me.
Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Jen for staying indoors, washing her hands, and of course, making time for the show this week.
I will continue not to lick the shelves at the shopping centre.
And
That
don't
sounds
forget, your face is lava.
Never.
that sounds like an excellent plan. Now, Jen, if people want to find your writing online or indeed your good self, where can they do that?
All over the internet, really. Daily Telegraph, news.com.au, Courier Mail, Melbourne Herald Sun, all over the place.
And on social media?
Yeah, I'm at Jen Dudley on Twitter.
Nice and easy to remember. And of course, you can always catch up with us on Twitter at VerticalHoldAU or via the Vertical Hold Facebook page.
And thanks again, everyone, for listening. And like we've been saying, we've got a great deal for regular listeners. Our great new sponsor, Aussie Broadband, has given us a special promo code which gives new customers a $10 a month discount for 6 months when signing up online for an unlimited plan. The promo code is vertical. So hopefully that'll come in handy for Aussie listeners shopping around for a great broadband deal. As always, thanks for tuning in. Try to stay at home, try to stay safe, and we'll see you again soon. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. Should you install a coronavirus tracking app on your phone? Yeah, I want to do that again. I didn't like the inflections. I don't know what the hell I was doing then, but it didn't work.